Well, let's
Thank you.
take the example I just gave. Okay, uh, the man who the man who fixed the car, packed his tools. We have explicit knowledge. We know what that means. Okay, we know that it means he carefully packed his tools. That's explicit knowledge. If you ask anybody what the sentence means, they'll say that's what it means. But we also have implicit knowledge of how it happens. Why does it happen? That carefully is associated with the linearly remote verb and not with the linear proximate verb. That's implicit knowledge. If you ask somebody to explain that, they can't do it. It requires considerable insight into the way language is designed and formed, the way computational systems work. So that's, but we know it. It's implicit knowledge. As I said, an infant of 30 months old, experiments have shown, already knows that. Of course, it's not explicit knowledge for the infant or even for an adult, but it's implicit knowledge. And in fact, it's like almost everything we do. Suppose we take a walk down the street. Uh, we know that if there's a stone in front of us, we should walk around it. We have no idea how we can get our legs to move in the proper manner so that we don't fall over. That's implicit knowledge, sometimes called tacit knowledge. Almost all of our knowledge is not accessible to consciousness. There's no possible way to introspect and find out what it is. It's internal to us, something going on within us. Same with the construction of sentences. You I understood what you said, you understood what I said, and neither of us can introspect and figure out how that can happen and why, if the words were, say, randomized, it couldn't do it. You can't introspect into that sort of thing. It's implicit knowledge, kind of like the knowledge that enables you to walk across the street. Can't possibly think about it and figure out what is going on. In fact, notice that humans, big mammals generally, have two brains. One brain is the one that's in our head. The other brain is in our gut. It's a huge brain, tens of millions of neurons, very much similar to what's going on in our brains. It can have diseases, it can have psychiatric diseases, pretty much the same thing as what's going on in our brain. What it's doing is regulating the basic functions of the body. You can't introspect into what the gut brain is doing. It's impossible. You can study it by from the outside, the way you study, you know, quantum physics from the outside, but have no way of accessing the knowledge. And the surprise of many people, the same is true of our thinking. You can't introspect into it. Even what we call inner speech, like talking to yourself. You can't go a minute without talking to yourself. It takes a tremendous act of will to stop this inner discourse that's going on all the time. But it's not inner, it's out, it's external. It's the externalization of language when your articulatory organs aren't working, you decide to inactivate them. What's going on inside is very different. The structure of the sentences that yields their meanings is absolutely beyond the level of any introspection, just like the operations of the gut brain are, or walking across the street. So there is implicit knowledge and explicit knowledge, and of course, there's interaction between them. Some of implicit knowledge does surface as explicit knowledge, but very little of it, and mostly quite superficial.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you, dear professor. So, if I'm not mistaken, you now mostly believe in continuum rather than a dichotomy, isn't it?
Sorry, but I didn't understand that. Could you say it again?
I said, which one do you prefer to use about the relationship between implicit and explicit? A continuum or a dichotomy?
Well, actually, not very much is known about that. When you're what we call talking to yourself, suppose you walk into a room and you see a friend of yours sitting there, and you think, oh, I'll go over and talk to him. But then you notice that he's talking to somebody else, and that other person who you know will be insulted if you say to the guy you were thinking of what you were planning to say. So you say, okay, I'll say something different. Then something else happens and you decide on something else. All of this happens in an instant, a single instant. You think you're talking to yourself, but you're not. If you really think about it, little bits of fragments are coming into your mind, a piece of a phrase, or maybe the end of the sentence before you begin to start the sentence. And from all of this is happening so rapidly that it would be impossible to articulate it. Well, that's the interesting part of language and social interaction. The part that you actually see on the surface is very unrevealing. I mean, for our lives, that's what we deal with. But the internal part is where all the interest is. In fact, there's some very strange things known that have been known for some years, not very well understood. So there were experiments a couple dozen years ago which showed that um, if you're deciding to, say, lift your finger a couple of 100 milliseconds before you lift your finger, you're conscious of wanting to lift your finger. But about maybe 300 milliseconds before that, the physical motions are already in, the brain is already carrying out and planning the the actual motions which are going to take place. This is long before you become conscious of having made a decision. So all kinds of means the decision was actually made unconsciously, well before uh, the uh, the plan to carry out the action even reached your consciousness. I mean, these are all, in a way, they shouldn't be too mysterious. It shouldn't be too mysterious that it's happening, because that's the way everything in the body works. Like you're totally unconscious of your gut brain, you're totally unconscious of how you walk across the street. You can't possibly become conscious of it. And the interesting recent understanding is that the same is true of your thinking and your speaking, almost entirely unconscious and beyond the level of consciousness. Little bits and pieces come out. We don't know why or how.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Look, I want to comment on the relationship between implicit and explicit knowledge, of course. When I was a graduate student at UCLA, which was the center of Chomskyan research, we were taught the theory, and it was obvious to me and everyone else, I now know this was dead wrong, that all we had to do was learn all about the latest descriptions of grammar from MIT and apply them to the classroom. I remember when Paul Kaparsky's papers came out, and we were all charmed by his analysis, factives, etc. I remember going over to my colleagues, I was also teaching English as a second language, saying, we now know how to teach this structure. We simply give people the rule that Professor Kaparsky came up with and give them exercises where they can practice it, correct them, and everything will be fine. We have the last 45 years of my life is showing the limits of explicit knowledge. It's simply not that way at all. We had the assumption that the language acquisition device turned off at puberty, which was the result of a really beautiful argument of Eric Lenneberg, which I now think is totally wrong, even though I have huge admiration for Lenneberg's work because he asked the right question. As Professor Chomsky has said many times, there's nothing wrong with being wrong. Lenneberg was wrong, but it really pushed us ahead. It was wonderful. He claimed that when you reach puberty, things happen in the brain. The left side goes to the left, the right side goes to the right, and acquisition, implicit learning cannot happen. Everything is explicit. My early research and research of my colleagues showed that was absolutely not true, that adults, children doing a second language, and young kids becoming literate went through a process that was totally implicit. It accounted for everything. I wonder these days whether that works with animal language, and someday we'll find out if this works for alien language. According to the merge hypothesis, probably not, but at least it asks the absolute right question. And I must tell you how disappointed I was, how disappointed my colleagues were because of our admiration for the grammatical systems that Chomsky and his colleagues came up with. But it certainly pushed us forward. We now know that it's certainly an implicit system. The similarities are overwhelming. We know that language acquisition at all ages runs on the same engine, which is basically comprehension of what you hear, what you read. It results in a predictable order of acquisition, and it's extremely difficult to apply conscious knowledge to language. It's nearly impossible. It takes all kinds of mental gymnastics, and it doesn't last very long. It's a very fragile system. So thank you for pushing us forward, asking the question, and I'm quite happy with the answer. And I think it's reduced a lot of suffering for people all over the world. That's my statement.
Comment?
I think that's quite right. Say take Eric Lenneberg, he was an old friend of mine. We were graduate students together, and as graduate students, we were part of a very small group, 3 or 4 people who didn't believe anything that was going on at Harvard. That was the heyday of behaviorism. Quine, Skinner, others, it all seemed crazy to us. We were off in some corner. Eric went off he made some very amazing discoveries, some of which he never even published because they were so outlandish that it didn't seem possible. So, for example, he was very much interested in language growth under unusual conditions. So, language of the deaf, for example. And one of the things he did was visit the school, I think it was the Perkins School, it was called, for the deaf in Boston, and observe what was happening. And those were the days of a very strict oralist tradition. Teachers were told, parents were told, you should never gesture to your deaf children because they have to learn how to lip read. So don't even hold your hands behind your back. Don't even do this. He went to the school. He noticed the teacher was strict oralist, but he noticed something strange. When the teacher turned to the blackboard, the kids started going like this to each other. They had obviously created a sign language. It's just part of their internal nature. By now, some things are understood about that. But at that time, it sounded like saying the earth is flat. So he told a couple of his friends, but he never said anything about it. But his work was exactly as you said, asking all the right questions. His book 50 years ago,
Biological foundation. Yeah.
Founded the biology of language. The contents of it are very much appropriate for today. It's a rich store of information and insights. Some of the answers probably wrong, but that's the nature of science. As you said, he asked the right questions, pursued them, pushed the subject very far forward. And that's the way developments have taken place. You have to look at today's best ideas as as well as that's where we are today, but they're probably wrong. The next generation will show there's a better way. That's the way understanding develops. It's what makes the field lively and exciting. Otherwise, it would be a bore. No point in even teaching.